So welcome back to the second half of the morning session. Our first speaker is Brian Andersen from the Niels Bohr Institute, and he's going to talk about Kagome superconductivity, conventional or unconventional. Brian?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to the organizers, and it's a pleasure being here. I have made an outline of this talk, which is, I will start with a very brief, somewhat biased status of superconductivity in the 135 Kagome materials. So this talk is really centered on superconductivity in these systems. And then I'll spend quite a bit of time on this, and then I will move on to if there is unconventional pairing in these systems, what kind of states stand out? And this will be slightly controversial depending on your mechanism and so on and so forth, but I will talk a little bit about that because it sets us up for some discussion of experiments and phase-sensitive probes. And here there's some good news in some sense if one is looking for exotic superconductivity. So the first part will be about disorder in Kagome superconductors, and here we'll have surprise number one. And the second one will be some recent work we did on the spin susceptibility, and here we'll have surprise number two. Okay, so I will first of all acknowledge my collaborators. These are the main collaborators in this project. So the two last projects are done by two excellent master students in Copenhagen. Morten Christensen and Andreas Kreisel are instrumental to everything I will say. Particularly Andreas has been involved in absolutely everything. So if you have questions and want to discuss after, he can be very good to talk to. Some of this stuff is already published. So the motivation for this is the 135 Kagome metals and their superconductivity. Of course, these are complicated systems, complicated Fermi surfaces, several bands, several orbitals are of interest. But the fascinating part, of course, is the electronic properties. We have heard quite a few talks today and also yesterday of several of these exotic electronic ordering phenomena that happens up here. But today I will focus on the superconductivity, okay? And I learned one very important thing from Sri's talk. It's important to make a disclaimer early on. And so of course I will basically, it will be toy models that we will be studying. So there is a leap of what's the relevance will eventually be for these systems and how does it connect to all these phenomena. There's a lot of work to be done before we can get there. Okay, so what is the nature of the superconducting state? It points in all kinds of directions. If we look at experiments at the moment, there is not a clear path, I would say, that guides us uniquely in one particular direction. Let me show you a selected amount of studies. So this is a quite direct probe of the superconducting gap. This is from an ARPAS study. And basically what's seen is this is both within the charge density wave, a superconductor coming out of a charge density ordered state, or where it has been removed, so there's no charge density wave up here. And it looks kind of homogeneous, this gap, and it looks kind of isotropic, right? However, there's plenty of other experiments where there's some kind of maybe evidence could be nodes, was at least a high anisotropy of this gap structure, for example, from thermal conductivity, STM seeing V-shaped gaps. There's even Bogoliubov quasi-particle interference finding gap anisotropy also, MUSR studies. So in that sense, it's not really settled what is actually the shape of the gap, the amplitude of the gap. Recently, there was some interesting, a series of interesting papers, I think there are even more than these, that sort of fall in line with some earlier MUSR studies advocating for time reversal symmetry breaking setting in only in the superconducting state. Which is interesting and not necessarily in contradiction to this. I mean, if you see this, you might think, oh, it's an S-wave, but what we will see is that one of the leading candidates in this system could be a D-wave, which is a two-dimensional irrep, so D plus ID could also give a roughly rough constant gap, so to speak. So that could advocate, all this could advocate for actually for unconventional superconductivity. On the other hand, if we zoom in to a series of other experiments, for example, disorder probes, you locally look at the density of states or conductance near various defects. This is actually a phase-sensitive. It's supposed to be phase-sensitive probe. One of the points of my talk is that in Kagome system, this is not a phase-sensitive probe. But anyway, it looks quite boring, to be honest, right? There's nothing in any of these supposedly non-magnetic impurities that do anything. If there were strong sign changes, we would expect to see in-gap states here, right? So in that sense, looks like a conventional superconductor. This is a plot that Sri showed us also yesterday. It shows the suppression of TC in a series of different materials. It's this material, but different quality of this. And what you see is there's basically not really any change. Whereas if it was an unconventional superconductor, there's this sort of universal Abacoso-Gorkov curve that one would expect these points to fall on. Again, this is pointing towards standard superconductivity. And the second is another point of my talk is that that is not a conclusion one can make for Kagome systems. This is a very detailed study from Taka Shibaoshi's group in Japan, where they start with a pristine crystal and then they systematically irradiate it and by doing this, they create point defects. And what you would expect from the penetration depth, this is the change in the temperature of the penetration depth, if it was an unconventional superconductor like S plus minus, standard cuprate D-wave-like system, you would expect there to be generated in-gap bound states which would change the temperature dependence of this penetration depth. But they do not see any evidence of that either, okay? So there's another thing pointing to S-wave. And finally, what's often mentioned in papers is the existence of this so-called Hebel-Slichter peak. Andreas Kreisel mentioned this in his talk yesterday. So in the Kagome systems, the 135s, there is indeed the presence of this kind of peak right below TC in the spin lattice, nuclear spin lattice relaxation rate, which is sort of a traditional telltale evidence for good old S-wave superconductivity. Looks like an S-wave, okay? Which is not bad. I have nothing against S-waves, but we're more interested in exotic physics or unusual states. And the point of my talk is that don't worry, we're not in trouble actually. All these last experiments I told you about do not imply S-wave superconductivity on this Kagome system. Okay, before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about unconventional pairing. What options do we have in this system? What states stand out, okay? So this is what, and here I will now go to the minimal model. So we just use the simple nearest neighbor hopping model with on-site repulsion and nearest neighbor repulsion. We've seen this toy model band structure several times already. Here's the bare part of the Hamiltonian. And the important point I will make is this so-called sublattice interference effect, or the fact that you have pure sublattice weight as you go around this Fermi surface and it alternates in this fashion, right? So if you are electrons moving in these directions, you are purely living on the B sublattice and so on. The importance of this, as was mentioned earlier, also was pointed out early on by Ronny, Thomale, and others. This will absolutely be crucial. Actually, this is basically my talk is consequences of that. So what kind of superconductivity is preferred? And here you have to make a choice. What is your pairing mechanism? Which horse are you going to try to ride to answer this question? So there's some bias here. I will tell you what we did, which is this kind of RPA approach, where one derives an effective pairing interaction by summing up all bubble and ladder diagrams. This is a somewhat biased approach because we're just picking these. But in systems, for example, if you're close to magnetic phases and you have dominating magnetic fluctuations or charge fluctuations of these kinds, it can give you some insight to what is the leading structure, okay? So, for example, in the cuprates, you get a D wave. In iron-based systems, this gives you an S plus minus. Strontium ruthenate, mainly what stands out is the same D wave as in the cuprates. So there's some, trust that this gives us a reasonable insight. So what's done is you generate this pairing vertex, and then by suitable constructions, one can find the spin singlet, the spin triplet and singlet channels and so on, and project this onto band space, stick it into the BCS gap equation, and this is then the linearized version of that. So you see this is like an eigenvalue problem, and the solution of this equation gives you the hierarchy of the superconducting instabilities. And so that's what we do. And as input to this, you get lots of bubbles. There's bubbles all over the place here. These are susceptibilities. Right? That's why there's charge and spin susceptibilities are crucial. So if we just look at that, so what will dominate, this is then actually these kinds of spin charge susceptibility channels as a function of these interaction parameters. So this is just the bare case. This is the upper Van Hove point. This is where we'll be interested, and we'll be working here. But there's also the lower Van Hove point in the band structure where you have this mixed structure. And here you see the first evidence. If we go over here to some case where we have some reasonable parameters, I guess, where U is significantly larger than V, if you're at the lower Van Hove point, you get sort of what you would naively expect from this, just the shape of this Fermi surface, a large peak at M. And whereas up here, the sublattice interference messes this up, and this matrix element becomes important, and you have several other peaks that sort of compete with each other and frustrates the solutions a bit. Anyway, what stands out, if we map out the phase diagram, I would say this region is the most realistic. This is the nearest neighbor, and this is the on-site Coulomb. So we're probably down here somewhere, which is this E2 irreducible representation, which is just this is the sort of most important spin singlet superconducting order parameter that will be present here, okay? So this you can look up, if you look at the irreducible representations of C6V or D6, then you can just look up. These are the three options for having spin singlet ordering. And this, I will advocate, this is the most prominent. Many other studies, other mechanisms, FRG, other ways of approaching it, also point to this as a relevant phase. One can argue, about parameters and where is it most important and so on. But I think this stands out as some leading candidate. Yes. No, this is actually odd parity solutions, but I would say there's not really strong evidence for any odd parity here. So I focus on the even parity ones, yeah. But these are actually, so this one is the P wave, two-dimensional P wave. This is the so-called F wave, one of the F wave cases. So this is then the gap structure, and if, it will probably be favorable to make this kind of linear combination or superposition of these two degenerate solutions, just because then you can gap out the whole system. Typically that lowers the condensation energy and that gives you a full gap. All right, but so then the question is, how can this ever be compatible with those experiments we just talked about? So then that takes me to the next part of the talk. I should say, by the way, that this project and involving this or solving all this, we had also a lot of collaboration with the group of Jose Valenti in Frankfurt. All right, let's go to the second part of the talk. This will now be about disorder. So let's focus, or let's discuss how does disorder affect superconductivity of the Kagome lattice? That's the question, okay? So here again, now the workhorse that I will focus on is the D plus ID superconductivity. So here we have the gap structure, and that is directly also reflected in this anomalous part of the Green's function. So this is plotted just on the Fermi surface, and that is exactly where you see the gap structure. The density of states, it's indeed fully gapped. Each of the two D-wave solutions have a nodes. This you see here, they each have nodes. But when you make the linear superposition, you get a full gap here. Wherever this full gap sets in has a little bit to do with the details of higher harmonics and so on, whatever is included in these. So you can either have it here. For this particular case, it's here. It could also be further out here and so on. Anyway, there's a full gap in this case. That's the only point we have to remember. Now, how do we include disorder? How does that work? I will mainly be talking about simple point-like disorder. Okay, so just two slides about the formula, one slide about the formalism. So this is our Hamiltonian. This is the hopping matrix. This is again the simple nearest neighbor. And then, of course, we include superconductivity. This is just standard Nambu space formalism. In that space, we include non-magnetic disorder in this form, magnetic disorder in this form. So I just put an impurity on an A sublattice site. That's why there's a 1 here and 0 everywhere else. Could also be a B or C, but let's just put it on the A sublattice. This is a non-interacting problem, so you can solve it exactly. The way it's done is through this, typically done is through this so-called T-matrix formalism. If I will get to a case later where I have it on all of them. Is that what you mean? Yeah. Yeah, there's a big difference with that. Yeah. Well, you'll see soon why that also is, but yes. There's no difference whether it's either A or B or C, but if it becomes extended and it probes all of them, then what I say starts breaking down, but it's part of the story, so we'll get there. Right, so one can then fully solve this by finding this total Green's function, and to do that, one needs to figure out what is a T-matrix, and T-matrix is just this, and it has an important denominator of this form, okay? All ingredients are easy to get because we know how to get the free Green's function, and we can just do a simple Fourier transformation, then we have all the ingredients here. The quantities of interest are the local density of states that we can compare with experiments, and also we'll be interested in the determinant of this because that is actually what tells us whether we have bound states solutions in our gap. So let's just first take a look at this, okay? No, before we do that, let's go back to the good old case. No, we do this. Yeah, let's take a look at where is the determinant of this particular denominator 0. That tells us where do we have the bound state, if we have bound states or not, and where are they located. That gives us a particular equation. So we just have to solve this equation where we have the Green's function components. A bar means that we're in the whole space. So this is particle-particle, hole, and this is the off-diagonal. This is the anomalous components of the Green's function, okay? And they are crucial. So if we go to forget about Kagome just for 2 seconds, we go back to the usual good old case, simple one-band physics. Let's take the standard S-wave case. Then we actually can quite easily find analytical expressions for these Green's functions. They're just written here. Okay? And the important point here is that the gap for S-wave case does not average to 0 on the Fermi surface. It has some finite value. If you stick in these two forms in this equation, you find those good old results that we all know. There are no bound states for non-magnetic impurities. TC suppression is weak. This is all part of Andersen's theorem. If you do, on the other hand, a magnetic impurity, you switch the signs, and then you find your Rushiba-Rusinov magnetic bound states. So this all comes out of this. If, on the other hand, one was interested in D-wave superconductivity, still on the usual good old maybe square lattice, in that case, the gap does average to 0. So the anomalous part, or the local anomalous part of the Green's function is 0. And then you can actually solve this equation also for non-magnetic impurities, and you found these bound or so-called resonant bound states even for non-magnetic impurities. So this is something that generally comes out for unconventional superconductivity. You know, some people will say this is the definition of unconventional superconductivity. So generally there will be such bound states in such case. The Rushiba-Rusinov states remain as they were. Okay, so naively, one would expect the same properties for superconductivity on the Kagome lattice. Unconventional superconductivity has this property. It should follow this, but it doesn't. Okay, so let's see why it doesn't. All right, so we go back to this equation. Now we're back to the Kagome lattice, and I plot the real and the imaginary part. This is what Sophie, the student, did, and she came in and she said, look, inside the full gap, there are no bound states. So what's plotted here is the real part of this determinant and the imaginary part for a range of different impurity potentials, like a huge range of different impurity potentials. This is the homogeneous density of states. So no matter what she did, she could never generate any bound states in here, inside the gap. It's like the gap is protected. This is very weird. The imaginary part is 0. There's a small change, but that's just because of this little artificial smearing we have in the problem. And indeed, if you go in and you look at what does the local density of states look like around this impurity, there are no in-gap bound states. Okay, yeah?
Brian, you have a finite quasi-particle lifetime, right?
Tiny. Well, no, I don't. I put in a tiny one.
But I mean, wouldn't that's the, like if I did something like a self-consistent Bohr,
Right,
get a
yeah.
finite lifetime, and wouldn't that smear out some of these things?
I think that will just smear out this, but it will not generate bound states in here. We do this in a little bit, but we have not, that is not included in this case, but I don't think that it will make solutions in here. I think it will just smear out these guys. Yeah. Okay, more questions? All right, so the question is why? Why does this happen? And I think probably Andreas was the first to realize this in our group. And he said, you know what, we should not be looking at this part of the Green's function because we have a problem with an impurity lives on an A sublattice or B or C. So we should go to the sublattice space, right? So we have to transform our band Green's functions into just the sublattice indices. So here I plot the various anomalous parts of the Green's function in K space on the Fermi surface. In sublattice space, okay? So this is the anomalous part of the A, B, and C. And basically all you have to do this is you have to make that unitary transformation from a band to a sublattice space. And that gives you these matrix elements that we have seen before, the sublattice interference matrix elements. So if we go to the A case, the anomalous part is completely washed out here because those matrix elements vanish in this direction, right? So it just focuses on these lines of the this is the real part and this is the imaginary part, by the way. And similarly, you see for the anomalous part of the B sublattice Green's function, you only see these upper and lower parts just as you would expect from these matrix elements, right? It just washes out the other part. But now, if this is the case, then what is actually clear is that this no longer averages to 0. It only averages to 0 in band space, not in this space. But this is the relevant space to be in. And the reason it doesn't average to 0 is because I'm interested in spin singlet, super even parity, right? Even parity means it has to have the same sign as I go across here. So so it's blue, blue. It doesn't vanish. So it's a bit of a mathematical explanation, but really it means that their scattering is very, very limited because of these sublattice interference factors. So that's the reason why we don't have any in-gap bound states in this case. If that's true, then it should be exactly the opposite for the P wave, because the P wave is odd parity, right? So it should basically always vanish. This would not help us. And so if we go and check we can, for example, go to the E1 irreducible representation and look for P plus IP. And here you see, indeed, the near cancellation remains, and you have bound states all over the place, right? So really, it's just a consequence of these sublattice interference effects. Additional consequences, there will be highly anisotropic scattering if you look at point-like impurities, could be relevant, for example, for QPI. Of course, in a huge field of view, you will average over these. You will have some that are on A and B and C sublattice and so on. But it would be fun to zoom in on one of these and see. They should have this kind of structure locally over them. Now, presence of bound states means strong pair breaking. And basically, these matrix elements limit the pair breaking. So that's sort of what you were hinting at. So we expect reduced pair breaking in this case.
This is also because you put impurities only on one sublattice, right? If you have a big impurity,
Yeah, exactly. That was his point later. Yeah. We get to that. But the experiments that I showed initially with the STM was single point-like impurities. The irradiation really kicks out one single atom and so on. So that's point-like impurity.
So if you have a homogeneous disorder, you would say it looks very different.
Yeah, if it's very smooth, it's still not harmful. But if it's clusters of atoms and things like that, it would be very, very different. Yes, there would be none of this. Okay, so let's do what Sri wants us to do. We do now this Abrikosov-Gorkov thing where we actually calculate the self-energy here it's just within the Born approximation, and then you recalculate the superconducting gap, and then you just iterate these equations until you have self-consistency. That's a way to extract the critical temperature, for example. And Sophie did this. And if you have the good old S-wave superconductivity, basically nothing happens. This is the good old Andersen theorem. If you have an unconventional superconductor, for example, you have D-wave superconductivity on a square lattice or anything of that sort, you follow this famous Abrikosov-Gorkov curve. This is what Abrikosov-Gorkov did a long time ago, right? And they found this nice curve. We just do it numerically here because we have sublattice space and it's a little bit complicated. But what you see is that for the Kagome system, it's very, very robust, right? It somehow falls in between these two. There's not really an Andersen theorem that protects it. There is actually a whole literature on generalized Andersen's theorem, and our Hamiltonian does not fulfill those requirements. That's why it's not fully up there. But it's not down here, and the reason it's not down here is because of this limited scattering channels caused by these sublattice interference, or the matrix elements, basically. Right. So this could be, it's good news if one is interested in unconventional superconductivity, because it explains why we might have an unconventional sign-changing superconductor and not see any in-gap bound states here. And there's not a big change in the temperature dependence of the penetration depth. There's not a strong suppression of TC depending on the disorder in your system. Question is, what about this guy? This one we have not addressed yet, the Hebel-Slichter peak. Yeah, before I get there, maybe I could say, in our paper, we of course study also this cluster of impurities that you have talked about. If you have them all three or a whole range, and then you are back to the usual situation. So if one could systematically actually probe different impurities and really look, it would be possible to check these things carefully, but that's probably very difficult. Okay, so the last part addresses here the so-called Hebel-Slichter peak. Does that kill kill unconventional superconductivity in the Kagome systems or not? So let's just revisit this for a few minutes. Go back to the good old square lattice. Let's say we have this very simple nearest neighbor hopping Hamiltonian. We're interested in this quantity first derived by Moria, I think back in the 60s. This is the nuclear spin lattice relaxation rate, 1 over T1T. And it's proportional to the momentum summed imaginary part of the susceptibility. Okay? At some very, very low frequency, which is typically the Larmor frequency. So it's very, very small frequency. Basically, it's a zero omega going to zero limit of this. Now, the susceptibility you can just derive for the superconducting state. It looks like this. And because omega is so small, and the E's, the quasi-particle energies, are limited by the gap size, the relevant quantities are these two factors down here, where you have opposite signs of these two E's down here in the numerator. So we can forget about these for the moment and just consider on these terms. And there, the relevant so-called coherence factor are these parts here. Okay? They vanish in the normal state, but now that's what superconductivity does. It brings these out and changes these quasi-particle energies. And we have defined another quantity that we'll look at, which is just this part, okay? Because at the Fermi surface, these don't matter, and so we just look at this part. We call this B. Okay, so let's take a look at that. For the usual S-wave superconductivity, this is the gap. what does this B factor look like? Well, it's complicated because it depends both on Q and K. Well, let me pick a K and plot it as a function of Q. Well, it has this shape and it has this cross because the Fermi surface in this case is just a half-filled case. And it's clearly something that has the same sign everywhere, and if you sum all this up, you get some number. On the other hand, for the D-wave case, we have sign changes on the Fermi surface. I pick again the same K point, I plot it in Q space, and it sums exactly to 0. This is just a property of the D-wave superconductivity. Right. But this has very important consequences because when one evaluates this quantity, then only for the S-wave case, we have this particular enhancement of this relaxation rate right below TC, where the gap shoots up, and you have an enhancement, so you get a 1 plus something, because this is finite, okay? So you get 1 plus something which is beyond the normal state stuff. On the other hand, for the D-wave case, this always sums to 0, so you just have your 1, which is the same as what you had in the normal state. So you just basically goes through like this. So that has none of this Hebel-Slichter peak. This is all well known, has been known for many years. I just show you that we know how to calculate this. It makes sense, it's all good. Now let's go to the Kagome case, and what superconducting order should we look at? This is the last part of my talk. So let's compare. Again, we take a good old S-wave superconductivity, and we compare that to D plus ID. Okay, this is a way to enforce D plus ID at the lowest level. You can actually do this on an on-site level. So this is what it looks like in real space. This is what it looks like in momentum space. So I just focus on these two cases, S and D wave, again. And we are still interested in the same quantity, the spin lattice relaxation rate. You just crank the machinery, same formula, except now again, we get our band to sublattice matrix elements, these so-called new modified coherence factors coming just from this unitary transformation. Okay? So that means that if we want to analyze this, we should look at a new sort of dressed B factor, not just what we call the bare one, that was the one we were interested in before, but now there's some new dressed part which also has a K and a Q dependence. And we normalize it by some number. This is not important for this right now. So if we go and look at the same plots as I showed you before, this is for the S-wave gap, and this is the D-wave. This is one of the D-wave gaps with two different K points. What you see again is that the bare one sums to some final value for the S-wave case, whereas the D-wave cases basically cancel in both cases, right? So if this was the correct calculation without the sublattice interference, without those matrix elements, one would get we would expect exactly the same as before, namely only a Hebel-Slichter peak in this case and not in this case. But that's not the correct calculation. One has to include those matrix elements. It's just obvious. And then you look at the dressed case. And now you see again that they wash out parts of the Fermi surface. So once again, this sort of cancellation effect is, well, here the cancellation effect is washed out, okay? And so you get some finite number when you sum this up over all of the Brillouin zone. So the difference between S wave and D wave doesn't look very big anymore if you look over here. And so indeed, if we calculate this in full case, all these states have a Hebel-Slichter peak. Right? They all have that. And to check it, we can remove these matrix elements but just put them to 1 in the numerics, and we're back to the usual situation where the D wave does not have 1. It's hard to see, but there's actually gray circles around here. The S wave is exactly the same case as it was with them. Okay. So that's the point of this part of the talk, that the spin singlet superconductivity on the Kagome laser does indeed feature a Hebel-Slichter peak. Also unconventional D wave, I should have written here. Right. So that's surprise number 2. Okay, so some small additional comments. For the same reason, if one was to do a neutron scattering experiment and try to look at the neutron resonance peak, this would be very, very hard, I think, because it's so small scales. But for the same reason that these coherence factors are important for the D-wave case, I would expect them to not be important up here. because we have the minus sign. The difference between these coherence factors is the plus and the minus. So we would expect there not to be a neutron resonance peak, even though you have an unconventional superconductor. At least it would be strongly reduced. Another thing is, actually the experiment was performed on the antimony nuclei, right? Not on the vanadium. So one has to be a little more careful in the calculation and include a whole bunch of form factors, which we have now also done, and it does not change the conclusions. This Hebel-Slichter peak remains. So that's sort of the conclusions of the second part of the talk, that unconventional superconductivity on Kagome is kind of deceptive, okay? It looks like an S wave. The sign changes of the gap function can get erased, so conventional phase-sensitive probes, quote unquote, are not really phase-sensitive. Okay? So the TC suppression rate is not expected to be very strong, and there should be a Hebel-Slichter peak. Of course, one can also put on the boring hat and say this is also consistent with S wave, right? But the point of this thing is not inconsistent with D wave or unconventional sign changing superconductivity where the gap averages to 0 all over the Fermi surface. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Brian. We have some time for questions. Any questions? I'll start then. So ignore impurities. If it's D plus ID, if you apply strain, you split the transition and increase TC, right? Do you know if those experiments have been done and if they see that, or?
I agree that should happen. I haven't seen that, no. I mean, they're not an overwhelming amount of experiments deep in the superconducting state, actually. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the nice talk. Maybe my question is really naive, but do you expect any to differ between S wave and D plus ID wave in any thermodynamic probes?
Yes. Well, yeah, this is similar to the question I got last time. You're saying all these things that look the same, but basically what's different, right? That's your point. What should we do then? Yeah, I'm thinking about this. I don't know what is then, because this was supposed to be the smoking gun or something, some clear difference between either the Hebel-Slichter peak or the purity physics, and there's no difference, right? So what is really the difference? Yeah, I'm not sure.
Strain-induced changes.
Yeah, if you do the strain, you see the splitting. That would be an important one. Yeah, that's true.
I see. I just asked because.
Yeah, but the two experiments I had here are phase sensitive, right? And the point is that they're not phase sensitive because of these matrix elements. So another phase sensitive, yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a hard one, I think, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was just saying because in routinates, the thermodynamic probes were essential to like pinpoint the D wave superconductivity. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. So your comment about the neutron resonance, my interest, and the lack thereof, your expectations. But I was going to ask you, all the neutron resonance work that I know of is consistent with that local moment. And here there's no obvious local moment. But you would still expect, at least in principle, expect some sort of neutron resonance in the absence of local moment that would
Yeah. I mean, this.
Are there any examples? Does such an example exist?
Well, I mean, if you just take okay. Well, one thing is theory, one thing is experiment, right? Theoretically, in an itinerant model where you have a metal and you go into the superconducting state, this This is the susceptibility, and that's what I was talking about. That there, for sure, if you have a standard D wave, you will find your neutron resonance. You're asking whether there are itinerant known materials. For, I don't know, iron pnictides, are we close enough? Cuprates, you would not say there. Of course, there's the 115, which is also, you have local moments. I guess pnictides is the closest case I know to a case that comes close to this. Yeah.
Anyway, I just
Yeah.
oh, and also you mentioned the energy scale. I think the energy scale being too small for and that's because EC is small.
Yeah, I guess it's not too small because neutrons can really go low in energy. So it would just probably be difficult, right? It's very low temperatures, and so big. You have to. The samples are small.
Brian, just a quick question. So can grain boundaries like a 1,0 or a 0,1, which take D plus ID to D minus ID, be a possible way of checking with local probe spectroscopy if they exist? I don't know they exist or not.
Probably, yes. Probably. You're thinking of certain surface states that will only be there if it's a D wave.
Yeah, because dx5 will go to minus dx5, so across a 1,0 or 0,1 there would be a phase change.
Right, yes.
So there might be some interesting
bound
physics.
states in some, exactly,
Yeah.
But
So,
that's a little bit similar to it's another phase sensitive.
Phase
But then
sensitive,
then once you do that calculation, what do the matrix elements do there? Do they cancel something? That would be a nice another project to look at.
And just one quick question. So I know it's another maybe complication story, but probably you've also thought about the CTW.
Yes. But that was part of my disclaimer early on because, how do we go from here to something more material specific for the 135s? I mean, there was a project where Turan was also involved where we tried to include some of the other bands, the pocket around gamma, which is the antimony band. And there we looked at how does that change the superconducting properties and so on. Of course, another point is you can remove the charge density wave state, right? You can actually go into a case where it's not there. And then I'm more happy with this. But if we start from a case where we know we have loop currents and so on, then which superconductivity does that push you into? That's a very interesting question. Very hard, but I mean, the reason we started here and just did not address that problem immediately was also based on the fact that experimentally, the Fermi surfaces does not seem to be massively reconstructed in the charge density wave. If you do it kind of looks the same as the norm state if you put it a little bit away. So, right, yeah. But it's obviously one of the next things to do.
Brian, while I walk over to the next question, I'll just I think Aaron has done the Kerr effect, but maybe not down to low enough temperatures to see whether,
Right.
it's on.
Yeah, I just had a comment, sort of riffing off Shree's question. So there's some problems with a lot of these STM experiments apparently, but if you had D plus ID, that could suggest some possible explanation for why some people see V shape and some people see U shape. Because if you had local strain fields in some part of your material, you might have something that's nodal, and in other parts you might have something that's fully gapped. So there were some experiments that actually saw both V-shaped and U-shaped, like in the same sample in like different runs of the experiment. So that's very indirect, and you could explain it a bunch of other ways possibly, but that's one possible indirect piece of evidence.
Yeah, thanks. It was very interesting analysis. So we did look with FRG for the D-wave phase, and you can also see the lattice harmonics from the pairing. So in that sense, we know whether it's first, second, or third neighbor pairings, and the D-wave phase has all that. So do you think your analysis would change if you considered not just nearest neighbor D-wave pairing, but also second, third neighbor, which means you have pairing between same and different sublattices, or it's just the two symmetry which kills it?
I don't think it would change at all. Like, this is all based on these cancellation effects or not, and so It should not.
Just to be
There will
clear.
be some quantitative changes. Actually, what part of this, you can generate the D-wave with on-site, right? That's the easiest way to do it. Including nearest neighbor, we check this and we get exactly the same. So that's what I meant with this gap, like where's the full gap exactly? So I think it will just change the details of it, but not the qualitative conclusion.
What I mean is not the interaction term. What I mean is that you have the effective interaction when you have the effective pairing, like a mean field pairing, and you put the D wave, say, in third neighbor bonds, where this changes something, or whether the E2 symmetry is sufficient to, kind of.
I don't think it will change very much, but we can discuss, yeah.
Thanks.
Any last quick questions? All right, so let's thank Brian once again.